How many posts or thumbnails do you see that say something like increase X by 400% or never do insert bad thing here again? Like do these 3 simple biohacks or this one secret trick. Full tricks are for kids. Like that's not science, that's marketing. And like something like this, talking about working at the cellular level, which all that we are ourselves. So if something works, by definition, it works at the cellular level. Good luck getting past the cellular level. But it sounds sexy and people are going to gravitate towards it. And I understand not everyone is a scientist. Most people aren't scientists, but that's kind of the point. Because most people don't have a background understanding of certain things where they can read a research paper or look at data or listen to something online that talks about something sciencey, something research based, and they don't have the ability to really interpret that data or that information that is being presented in a way that is actually representative and appropriate to that data. Like people consuming that content, they don't know. They don't have a background in these subject areas to be able to discern those types of things. And so there are issues with people coming across this content, trying to figure out ways to improve themselves and make themselves healthier and get more fit and all of that, and adopting these strategies or protocols when there is actually very, very little data to support their use. And understand that talking about these things can get people more interested in their health. That could lead to positive behavior changes. But the issue is people are being misled and they're buying into things that are oversold and oftentimes don't have data behind them. A lot of times what they're doing is they're taking mechanistic data that sounds super fancy and novel, which it is. It is really interesting research. But what they do is they take that and translate that into context of which you cannot do, including informing how humans should train or eat and confusing mechanisms and outcomes. It grabs your attention. It sounds super sciencey, like frontier of science type stuff, but they're really just using that language to get you to consume their content or buy their program or download their app or buy their supplement. That's the game they be playing a lot of the time. Misrepresented data be damned. And a lot of times I think individuals just take their information based on vibes. And science has become a vibe. It's an aesthetic. It's a marketing tool. Science, or the aesthetic or vibes of science, is now just a tool as a commercial for products, for content, for services, most of them unnecessary and or lack any sort of empirical evidence to them. And there's nothing wrong with talking about interesting science and research, including stuff that has like big time implications in the future potentially. But there's a difference between talking about the specific data and the potential applications or impact, sometime in the future, versus talking about these really obscure, esoteric, basic data as if they have application now in real life for people to take and use, for people to apply. Now, I'm not saying terms like backed by science or science-based are bad things. If I'm working with a client, I'm gonna do things that are science-based or evidence-based, backed by research. That's not the issue. The issue is when those terms or science or research are used unscrupulously in order to push something. And the idea of the science or being science-backed is used more as a marketing tactic used by people or companies or people on behalf of companies. It's to create a vibe, to get people to want to engage or buy your stuff, to create the feeling of, oh, this is science-backed. I love science, where science is primarily a means to drive revenue rather than the science itself being used to validate the claims that are being made and the efficacy of the use of whatever the product or service is. It's an aesthetic more than it is a principle. And most of the time, if you go track down the science that is being cited, it's oftentimes very different than the claims that are being made, including times where the data do not substantiate the claims at all. These claims are based on very, very shaky data or have a very, very weak and tenuous relationship to the data they're actually citing. And they're really not that science-backed after all. There's nothing wrong with talking about this science. There's nothing wrong with talking about these data. This stuff is really cool. It's one of the reasons why I became a professor of exercise physiology. So I could talk and study these things. Most of my classes are like 3 hours long, and that's never enough time. I have to force myself to stop talking about these things. And I never get through all the things that I want to get through in a semester. So I understand talking about these topics and this research is really interesting. It is really cool. But you have to do so with all of the necessary and appropriate context related to that data, so they don't come away with the wrong impression or idea of their significance and actual direct impact to them. There are so many things on social media and podcasts and like thumbnails that as a scientist, someone who actively does research, I would not feel comfortable saying. There are things as a professor, as an educator, that I would not feel comfortable saying to my students in that way. And there are things that I would not feel comfortable saying as a practitioner if I was talking to one of my clients. However, there are scientists and doctors and other professionals that are making statements or presenting things that are just unfounded, misleading, and especially if you're someone that is in science or in medicine or in higher education, that are just disingenuous. If you take some of these individuals out of the podcast TikTok space and actually put them in their professional setting where there are standards of practice, where there are ethical norms or legal implications, whether that be in a classroom with their students or in a lab with their research group or a physician with a patient, like they would not be saying the types of things that they are saying on podcasts to those people in those settings. And I understand if you're talking to a general population, you can't talk as if you were writing a research paper or at a professional scientific conference. But as a scientist or an educator or a physician, you at least have to be committed to the actual data. This is what I have to do with students. You have to communicate things in a way that it is understandable to them, but you still have to reflect what the actual data and research say. There's a difference between education, including passionate education, and like proselytizing, like you're some preacher or TV evangelist. A student asked me, after giving like a 2.5 hour lecture on autophagy and finishing up with the conclusion here of like autophagy from a practical standpoint really is not that important. She asked, well, if it's not important, why do you study it? I said, that's a good question. That's a fair question. Not all science, not all research has direct application to your life. Not all science is translatable into action, and that's okay. Sometimes we just need to know things for the sake of knowing things. And maybe sometime down the line, then there could be applications made. But not all science has to have direct applications or implications. And people can research different things. People can research things that are really, really applied, or people can research things that are really, really basic and have little to no application. And there's a whole area between those two ends of the spectrum, of which exercise physiology is making ground in. I'm much more comfortable with maybe, potentially, likely, possibly, implicated, associated, those types of terms, not these definitive, conclusionary, absolute statements. But these terms lack certainty. But guess what? A lot of things lack certainty. I understand that someone can look at data and come away with a different interpretation and say, I'm perhaps being too stringent. I perhaps am being too conservative when it comes to interpretation and translating and applying what the current body of evidence is. And yes, I am being conservative and stringent, especially when it comes to taking specific data and then applying them into a context outside of what that study was performed in, particularly of taking these data and then applying them into practice. I myself am active in research as well as a practitioner in the field. And as a researcher, I have to contend and consider what the limitations of my research is. What can I actually say and conclude from my data? Where and when might it matter? And when does it not? And trying to not overstep that line. As a researcher, I have to consider does this even matter? And be okay with whatever the answer is. And as a practitioner, I have to read the research and try to discern what actually matters in practice, what is actually relevant and what is not.